Hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you to Yes's Ask the Author webinar today, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Bryce Stewart from the Department of Environment and Geography, who will be talking to us today. Bryce will be talking about the marine conservation work that he's been involved with in the Isle of Arran. Welcome, Bryce, and I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks everyone for joining me on this lovely afternoon. I'm sure you'd rather all be out somewhere like the Isle of Arran, but for now we'll have to make do virtually. So first of all, I just want to thank YESI, or the York Environmental Sustainability Institute, for setting all of this up. For those of you who don't know, YESI is based at the University of York, and its job really is to facilitate world-class and particularly interdisciplinary research on environmental sustainability. It has three main research themes: sustainable food, led by Professor Bob Doherty; resilient ecosystems, led by Professor Jane Hill; and urban living, led by Professor Alistair Boxall. So they do a lot of work sort of facilitating funding bids and helping run projects, but also obviously they set up and run events like this. And this Ask the Author initiative is their sort of latest effort to sort of move the research that we're doing at the university out to the sort of the wider public. So I hope you enjoy the day. If you want to find out more about YESI, you've got their website on the slide there. They're quite active on social media, on Twitter particularly, and they also have a newsletter which comes out every week, I believe. So just so you know, this session is being recorded. If you do have questions, then type them in the Q&A section of Zoom, and I'll do my best to answer them afterwards. Okay, so on to the presentation. So as you all hopefully know, this is based on our recent paper in Frontiers in Marine Science that was called Marine Conservation Begins at Home. And you know, I was lucky enough, along with Lee Howarth, to be the lead author on this. But this is obviously a story that has involved many people, probably hundreds of people if we added them all up. And a small selection of them are in this picture here, outside of the new Marine Education Centre, or otherwise known as the Octopus Centre on the Isle of Arran. For those of you who don't know, I'm a senior lecturer at the Environment and Geography Department at the University of York. I'm also quite active on Twitter, so if you like what you hear today, then feel free to follow me. Right, so I thought I would start with a story. Now this is Lamlash Bay on the Isle of Arran, clearly a very beautiful place. I first went there in 2011, and in fact that's when this picture was taken. And I was sat there at the end of the day. I'd been out lobster fishing that day, I believe, just chilling out, and I saw this young lad come down to the water's edge with his fishing rod. You know, he was about 13 or 14, and it took me back to, you know, when I was his age, and the one thing I loved more than anything was going fishing. And so I should have been feeling excitement for him, but instead I felt my heart sink, and I wanted to go up to him and just say, "Come on, mate, let's go and play football instead." So why would I feel like that? Well, basically because his chance of actually catching a fish was sadly fairly remote. And the reason for that is because the Firth of Clyde, in which the Isle of Arran sits, has sadly seen a huge diminishment of fish species, fish stocks, particularly over the last decade, but in fact most significantly in the last few decades. And this tells the story here. It was dubbed by a couple of my colleagues, Callum Roberts and Ruth Thurston, as an ecosystem in meltdown. Not everyone agreed, but it's certainly a very changed and degraded ecosystem. So here is the Isle of Arran here. Glasgow is just up the top there, and you can see on the west coast of Scotland. And it was once a very, very productive area for marine fin fisheries, very diverse, a whole range of different species, but it was also quite well managed originally back in the early part of last century. But as demand for seafood grew and stocks in the areas available to be fished sort of started to diminish, the restrictions that were in place, such as originally a ban on trawling, bottom trawling in the Clyde was removed. And then following that, a ban on trawling within 3 miles of the shore. So this graph shows just the landings of cod, for example. And you can see that when those bans were removed, originally there was quite high landings, but then they fell away very, very quickly. And since about 2010, there's been really insignificant landings, commercial landings of Atlantic cod. If we group it all together for round fish, which is just things like cod and haddock and whiting, etc., then it's a very similar story overall. This is real decline in those round fish species. In their place, what we've seen instead is the rise of the invertebrates. So particularly nephrops, so these are Dublin Bay prawn or scampi to most people. The landings and the fishery for them have become increasingly important, and also other shellfish such as particularly scallops, but also crabs and lobsters. And the fishery in the Clyde now is about 99% based on those shellfish species. Almost nothing, just a tiny bit of bycatch of fish. Other people have dubbed it not so much an ecosystem in meltdown, but an ecosystem in transition. Well, I mean, it's fair to say it has already undergone the transition. And what we see here is a real loss of diversity. So these are not landings data, these are from fisheries independent surveys. This is going back to the 1920s to 59, and all these colors represent different fish species. And you can see that in the last set of series done between 2005 and 9, very, very dominated by whiting. And actually those whiting are all very small. There's some indication that they're actually breeding at smaller sizes and as well. So you've got a very changed ecosystem in both diversity, but also in the composition of the fish community and the overall abundance. So what to do about this? Well, this didn't entirely go unnoticed. And here enters our sort of 2 central characters to this story. We have Don McNeish and Howard Wood, who were local residents on the Isle of Arran, but importantly, they were scuba divers. And, you know, this was something that they did. In fact, Howard was a commercial diver for a few years. And so they were witnessing firsthand this change in the marine environment. And what was really sort of important here was Don actually went on holiday to New Zealand in the early 90s. And over there, they were just starting to play around with marine protected areas as a way of sort of protecting some pockets of the ocean so that recovery could start and hopefully spill over into the surrounding area. And so he came back all enthused and talked to Howard and said, this is what we need on Arran. This is what we need to do to bring back, you know, this marine life that we've lost. And, you know, to cut a long story short, 13 years of campaigning, they eventually got a marine protected area, in fact, a no-take zone, which is completely protected from fishing. They formed along the way the NGO called COAST, or the Community of Arran Seabed Trust. They worked with, they engaged with the local community right from the start, including the local fishermen who lived on the island. They also worked with the Clyde Fishermen's Association, who represent the fishermen in the wider area, and then together did, you know, really move things forwards. Unfortunately, that relationship sort of broke down towards the end, but it still was very important in, you know, moving this campaign, this drive to have a protected area along. Along the way entered Tom Valaboyle here, and this is probably about the time I met these, the three amigos. It was about 2003, I believe. And they were, you know, a real force for change. And eventually in 2008, they had a small part of Lamlash Bay that we saw before protected, fully protected from all fishing, as an experiment to see if it would revive the area, including both conservation features, but also importantly commercial species of interest like scallops and lobsters. And we have here Richard Lockhead, who was the minister responsible. So he looks pretty much as happy as them, which is interesting to see. So here's Lamlash Bay no-take zone. It is pretty small, only about 2.7 kilometers squared, but it's very significant. It was Scotland's first no-take zone, and still is its only one. And as I said before, it was importantly designed to benefit both fisheries and conservation. So I obviously had known Howard and the others since I said in about 2003 or 4, and I'd sort of helped them a bit with their campaign as I could by providing them, you know, scientific information and research papers and things like that. And so I kept a close eye on this, the progress of this work. And back in 2010, Howard got in touch and said, "Do we really need somebody to do some detailed research to monitor the recovery?" And I had a very enthusiastic young master's student, Lee Howarth, who was raring to go. He wanted to do some diving in the UK because he thought that would be character building. And I think probably it's fair to say it was. So he teamed up with Howard, and they did really the first underwater surveys of the no-take zone and of the surrounding area as a control to see how the two areas were different from each other. So the first thing that really came out of that work was that already, even after a couple of years of protection, there was a lot more macroalgae, seaweed on the seabed in the no-take zone. And there was also a lot of juvenile scallops. So here we can see some juvenile queen scallops. These would be sort of the size of a 5p coin or so, not pretty small. But they settle on substrate like this for the first month or so of life before they detach and become free living. So this sort of habitat is really important, and it was more abundant in the protected area, and so were the scallops. From there, from that early sort of significant result, we managed to get funding for Lee to do a PhD. And here is the results of his dive surveys over the next 3 years. So he continued to do this sort of work. In terms of the settlement of juvenile scallops, apart from this last year when there was very little settlement at all, and this is just a feature of scallops, there was always more settlement of these juveniles in the protected area than in the control area outside. He also obviously monitored adult scallops. The story here was not quite as clear cut. From an initial point where there were actually less inside, there was a slow increase inside, but only in this year was this statistically significant. So there wasn't really a strong response of adult scallops in these first few years. But the scallops were larger, and this is important again. This shows the size composition. We got different sizes of scallops on the bottom axis here. The white bars represent the ones in the reserve, in the no-take zone. And then in the wider Clyde are these dark ones. So this is throughout the Clyde estuary. And you can see that there's a real shift towards larger scallops actually in the protected area. Lee was also monitoring what was going on the seabed. He was taking lots of photos and analysing them, thousands in fact. It's a pretty tedious but interesting thing to do. And following how things changed over a period of time. And he separated out the species into sort of two groups. One was what we call mobile, so they were able to move of their own free will. and the others are attached to the seabed. And what we saw was really not a strong response from these mobile species, but for the ones attached to the seabed, actually both near the reserve, but also particularly in the reserve, a strong increase over time. And again, this was significantly different from what was outside. So we're starting to see a few different effects in these early years. And the survey really grew from there. We also started to monitor the fish communities, originally with our sort of homemade BRUV, which stands for Baited Remote Underwater Video. This is a lobster pot with a GoPro inside. It's actually quite effective, and you put a bait down there. You drop this for about an hour, and then you see what comes along. More recently, this work has really been led by David Bailey and his team at the University of Glasgow, who we also collaborate with. And we started to see the appearance of more and more juvenile fish over time as well. And then finally, we expanded to look at what was going on with crustaceans, with crabs and lobsters. And this required a different method of surveying. This is basically working on board a commercial creeling boat. And we had sites both in the no-take zone here, nearby controls here, and then also further away controls at the south of the island. And what we saw here was really interesting. So we saw a very strong response in terms of catch rates, catch per unit effort, or CPUE of lobsters. But actually the reverse for particularly brown crabs. And, you know, this is important to realize that when you protect an area, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to go up in number. What you're actually seeing is a shift towards what you might call a more natural state. And that can mean that some things will go up and some will go down. So for lobsters, it was fantastic. But it appears that the lobsters actually outcompeted the brown crabs. We've even got video showing the lobsters chasing the crabs away underwater. So it's really important that, you know, remember this sort of complexity. And looking at this time series of crustacean surveys, we started in 2012. The last ones we did were in 2018. You can see in the reserve, again, it started off, the numbers were the same, but over time, although things went up and down, they did change. And particularly in terms of legal sized lobsters, there's a really big difference. It's roughly 4 times more, goes a little bit up and down. But for these other species, there's not a clear pattern. So again, sort of re-emphasizes that point. So along the way, after this initial protection of Lamlash Bay, on the back of that early success, so here's this little red area here is Lamlash Bay no-take zone. Coast, Community of Arran Seabed Trust, campaigned for a much larger marine protected area. And this was one of actually 30 in total that were being set up around the coast of Scotland at the time. So it was designated in 2014. And then the protection measures came in 2016, January 2016. And you can see that it's a multi-use area. So you're allowed to, in this green zone, do a certain amount of trawling for the prawns. You're not allowed to scallop dredge anywhere. You are allowed, however, to creel fish in most of this area, except for obviously the no-take zone, but also not in these blue areas. This protects seagrass and this protects merle, for example. So, you know, a really nice sort of example of zonal fisheries management and conservation. It was hard won. There was a lot of debate about exactly what management measures should be put in place. Certain members of the mobile fishing industry were quite against the level of restrictions that were put in place. There was an interesting sort of series of protests outside the Scottish Parliament, but in the end, Richard Lochhead, the minister, who, as I said, was behind the no-take zone, you know, stuck to his guns and went ahead with that level of protection. So we hadn't done any diving surveys for a few years since then, but last summer, thanks to this magnificent team, Lauren James and Will Notley, my two students here, and Jason Coles, who was the dive skipper and around the boats, they went back and they surveyed in the no-take zone, in the original controlled areas, but also throughout the larger marine protected area as well. And what they found was pretty extraordinary. What we saw was, if you look at these original densities of adult scallops that Lee counted, was a huge shift upwards, both in what was the control area that was now largely protected in the MPA, and also in the no-take zone itself. So since the beginning, we'd seen, roughly a 4-fold increase in those two areas. So pretty big change in density. We also set up a new area, which, because our original control site was now protected, so we needed an area that was now being dredged. And you can see the density here. Again, it was much lower. It was about 2.7 times higher in these well-protected areas than in the dredged area. So, oh yeah, there you go. Good memory. And again, so it shows, the strong effects of protection. And this has been seen in other studies as well. That can take a while to start, but then it really builds and takes off. I think one of the most interesting results for me was what had happened in that wider, that new large South Arun MPA. And here, even after just, a few years of protection, so January 2016 to July 2019, we actually saw more than a 6-fold increase in the density of king scallops. And that's what we're seeing here. Didn't work so well for queen scallops. This is actually not surprising. Other studies back this up. Queen scallops are more mobile and they are quite variable in their population densities. But it seems to work really well for these larger king scallops. And in terms of biodiversity and habitat that was revealed from these surveys, again, some interesting things are going on. In terms of number of species, it's roughly stabilized, and biodiversity indices and things like that, but things are still changing. So we're seeing some species go down, but we're actually seeing the appearance of more kelp. We're seeing the appearance of some of these what were previously rare species. This is a monkey puzzle rhizoan with a queen scallop on it. We also found that the density of juvenile cod was significantly higher in the no-take zone in 2019. And in the South Arun MPA, which remember had been protected for much less time, actually overall there was, in that area, there were increases in biodiversity, and particularly just in overall density of animals living on the seabed. So this slide here is out of our paper. It kind of summarizes the effort that's gone into this. As I said, I think over a dozen people have been involved in doing these surveys directly, and many more on the sides. But you can see some of our key results about particularly these commercial species. Scallops and lobsters have done really well. The merle, which is a type of like a coral-like seaweed, it hasn't so much increased in the no-take zone, but it's maintained its presence, which was really important because it was one of the reasons it was set up. But also what we have seen is an increase in algae sponges. Feather stars are interesting. They went up originally, but now they've really gone down everywhere. And again, this sort of highlights that we don't know everything about what's going on under the water. So the story continues, and I think what's for me been really significant about this, being involved in this project, is not just the science, but the implications of the work and the influence that it's had on marine conservation. I think across the UK in general, it is one of only 4 no-take zones. It is by far the best studied, and the community of Arun Seabird Trust have really done a great job of not only engaging with their local community, but actually working with people, in fact, from all over the world to promote, you know, their success, but also what works and what doesn't work. And, you know, just a couple of examples of this. They opened recently the Octopus Center, which is a, you know, designed for the public. It's a marine education center where they also run a lot of activities. They do snorkel tours, rock pool rambles, etc. I even managed to convince my kids here to watch a few videos about my work, which, you know, normally that would be considered pretty boring. And another example here is this Coastal Communities Network. So now we have roughly 15 other communities around the coast of Scotland who are trying to replicate the sort of thing that Coast did, to really become engaged with their local marine environment and to be really involved in helping to ensure that it is conserved for future generations. It's also, I think, fair to say, had a pretty big influence on the development of marine protected areas in the UK in general. Now, there are lots of these now, if you look on this map, but as I said, there are only 4 no-take zones, and they represent a tiny amount, about 20 kilometers squared of this entire area. However, there was in fact, it's an ongoing review about whether or not we should be having more of these really well protected areas. And the work that's been done on the Isle of Arran has been really key to informing that review. And we look forward to the results of that, hopefully in the next couple of months. So what has been the secrets to success? I think absolutely the fact that Howard and Don engaged with the local community right from the beginning, including the local fishermen. You know, from my point of view, it's been great to have such a fantastic place to study, but I think that's fair to say that has helped Coast in their mission as well, because they have really used the scientific evidence well, and that's been key to the success of their campaigns. They've also had to learn the workings of, you know, how policy develops. There wasn't even the, you know, the legislative mechanism to have a no-take zone when they first started on this, and to become engaged with politics, something I've sort of started to dabble with too. And of course, you know, working with the media and outreach activities in general are really important, and they've done a great job of that. And then finally, giving back to the community. So now they have this fantastic you know, outdoor octopus center on the island that allows people to come, and they're very good at communicating what they're doing and the results of the science, and providing all of these activities. So overall, you know, I think it's been a great success story. So what I'm going to do now is just hopefully show you a little video that sums up, perhaps better than what I could, what it's all about.
Bryce, just to let you know, it's not showing on the broadcast.
Oh, right.
You may have to change the window that you're sharing if it's popped up into another window.
Yep, okay. I'm sorry, I don't quite know how to do that.
Do you want me to share my screen with the video on?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't think that's working anyway either. Jane. Okay. Is it possible to just continue to the Q&A?
I think we'll just have to, yeah. I'll provide the video link separately. Can you just show the acknowledgement slide?
Can you see the acknowledgement slide now? The any questions slide?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Bryce. That was really interesting. We'll proceed to the Q&A slide now. The Q&A session now. At the bottom of the screen, if you want to type in any questions, there's a Q&A button there. You just hover over it and you can type in your questions. And I'll read you the first question. Once you've answered, we'll unmute Stephen and he can ask any follow-up. So Stephen Thompson's asking if you have any information about how the local fishing community has responded to and engaged with the initiative, and has this changed over time? Also, is there any different perception, opinion among different sections of the fishing fleet through the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, so can everyone hear me now, I'm guessing? So thanks everybody. Sorry about that technical glitch with the video at the end. Hopefully I can send that around to everyone who's interested. It was all going so well, but anyway. So in answer to your question, yeah, the key thing I think is that there's been different views among different sectors. So the local fishermen who actually live on the island are mostly fishing for crabs and lobsters, and they have been very, very supportive. And in fact, we work with them closely. We hire their boats to do the research. They see particularly the no-take zone as being quite beneficial, because we know from tagging work that I didn't show you there that lobsters are sort of are moving as the numbers build up in the no-take zone. They're moving outside, and of course they're also breeding at high levels inside the no-take zone, both the scallops and lobsters, and so that is thought to be providing, you know, lots of young individuals to the surrounding area. And the Creole fishermen who both are on the island and the ones who come across from the mainland are also generally in support of the bigger marine protected area, because it's an area that they used to share with the dredge and trawl fishermen, and so mostly they had to keep their Creoles close inshore to be out of the way of the operations of those boats, apart from during the weekend when there's a ban on mobile gear in the Clyde. And so for them, it has been beneficial, absolutely. the guys who fish, who troll for prawns, have not really been affected very much because, as you may have seen from that map, they're still allowed to trawl around the edges of the protected area. The scallop dredge fishermen, yes, they have lost that area of fishing ground, and it's fair to say they're not all a fan. But for me, it's all about striking a balance, and you know, it is primarily a conservation designation, and it's designed to protect some important habitats to increase biodiversity, and it's definitely doing that. That's what our work shows us. But as an added benefit, you know, if you think about the fact that there are these very high numbers of scallops, they are larger, they have much larger reproductive organs, and also they're closer together, so they're breeding much more effectively. And we've worked out that actually in the no-take zone, for example, the scallops there are producing probably as many young scallops as an area of fishing ground that is 20 times its size. So it's very hard to prove these things, but you know, all the evidence suggests that actually it is providing a wider benefit.
Do you have any follow-on questions, Stephen?
Well, that's great. Thanks very much. And I think it's very, very useful and beneficial to have all those points backed up by data, as you do have. That's great. I was just wondering, is this support from the local fishermen, is that something which has grown with time, or was it always there? And
I think it probably has grown with time. I mean, I've only been involved with this story for, you know, the last 10 years. The story, you know, goes back over 25 years. So I think in the early days, there was probably a bit of convincing to be done. You know, Howard Wood, who's really one of the main instigators, would say the solution was they got everybody together, fishermen, other interested people, local residents, and everyone went to the pub, and you know, they talked it through, they shared opinions, and things went from there. And it's often the best way. And what was important was that they did that early on, you know, and support has built over time.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Thank you. We've got a question from Lucy asking, what do you think has led to the significant increase in density of scallops in the MPA in such a short time?
So I think for me, what it shows is a couple of things. One is that it was clearly an area that was good for scallops, but was probably quite heavily fished. So the numbers that were you know, that were there when we started, like before it was protected, were really reduced from what it can actually support. The other thing would be that there was a strong year class of scallops sort of coming through at the right time. And I've worked on a few different marine protected areas, specifically on scallops. And sometimes you see it can take, you know, 5 or 10 years for, you know, for the recovery to happen. But if the recovery, partly by chance, happens to be timed when there is, you know, been some good breeding going on, then that instead of those scallops being fished, they'll then carry on and appear in the adult population. So one thing that's important to sort of highlight there is, although I talked early on about, you know, us counting lots of juvenile scallops, you can see them when they are settled on the seaweed and the bryozoans and things like that when they're very young. But then when they detach and settle on the seabed, the young scallops are really difficult to see. And so we're not always sort of aware of them until they get to be 1 or 2 years old. So there's a period there when we're not entirely sure what's going on. So I suspect that's what happened, because we also saw, you know, between 2013 and 2019, that really big recovery in the no-take zone as well. So over that 6-year period, there was there was a huge change, whereas in the first 6-year period, there wasn't.
Do you have any follow-on question, Lucy, or has that answered your question?
No, that's great. Really interesting. Thanks very much.
Lovely. We've got another question from Ailsa, sorry, which I think you maybe have answered already, asking, do you have any tips for dealing with hostile mobile sector of fishermen, and how do you stop people falling into familiar entrenched positions?
I mean, I think one thing, you know, that's a difficult question to answer. And, you know, it's fair to say there's still a number of fishermen who are not very supportive of these measures, of the mobile fishermen. As I said, there's many others who are. I think really that, you know, that disappoints me. That's quite sad. And I, you know, I've really always tried to take a balanced approach and to communicate the results very openly, and to, you know, show that, you know, for example, some species are going up, some are going down. But also I think it's important to highlight those benefits, like I said, about how the scallops and the lobsters are breeding at these really high rates. And although these measures have involved taking away some areas of fishing ground, overall, there should actually be more scallops in the system and more lobsters in the system. And so it's a way of like investing, if you like, with a really high rate of return. And getting those messages across is what it's all about. And I continue to try and do that. And, you know, I hope that we'll continue to move forwards.
Thank you. Do you have any follow-up, Ailsa?
No, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have another question from Peter asking where the other 3 no-take zones are. Have they been successful in showing recovery?
The honest answer is we're not entirely sure because they haven't been as well monitored. So probably the next best studied one is the one at Lundy Island. And that was well studied in the early years, the sort of first 5 or 6 years of protection. And they likewise saw, particularly for lobsters, very rapid increases in the numbers of lobsters and the size of lobsters. They didn't see the same response on the seabed, but then it was an area that wasn't dredged or trawled, so you wouldn't expect that. One of the other ones is at Flamborough Head, and I've done some study on that. I've mainly been involved with my students in studying the intertidal zone. The intertidal zone is not under that much pressure because, you know, basically only from people who maybe take species for bait and maybe eat the odd periwinkle. But we have actually seen some increases in those species. I believe, I haven't been involved in the work on the crustaceans, but they've seen some increases, particularly in the catch punit effort of lobsters as well. The seabed there, because of the conditions, is much more difficult to study. It's an area of high currents and poor visibility, so it hasn't been well studied. And then the third one is in the Medway estuary, and it's only just recently been protected. So, you know, there's mixed evidence. Most of them haven't been well studied. So it's hard to say too much. Obviously, the one on Arran has been, and the evidence is pretty good. But in all cases, these no-take zones are very small, and that does limit, you know, really what they can offer. And I think that's why we probably saw the best responses in species that don't move very much. But certainly, if you're wanting to protect, you know, the sort of larger fish species and the more mobile fish species, then you're probably going to need something a bit bigger before you see those advantages.
Thank you. Do you have any follow-up, Peter? Oh. No, I don't. I think we've lost Peter.
Sorry, apologies. I unmuted the wrong Peter. Peter, I think you should be able to talk now.
Yes, thank you. I just wondered how much enthusiasm there'd been from the Scottish Government about this study, and whether they are considering commissioning further no-take zones in their sea areas.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure is the answer. I mean, this one was set up in 2008, and, you know, 12 years later, we don't have any more. So I guess that sort of partly answers your question. It's, from my point of view as a scientist, it's surprising because, you know, no-take zones are very common in other parts of the world. There's a lot of science to show that if you really want to make a difference, that is the way forward. And I'm not suggesting that we have huge areas of sea that are no-take, but to only have, you know, sort of 20 kilometers squared in the whole of the UK, I mean, it works out as something like 0.001% of our territorial waters. You know, you're never going to see them doing that much. So I really look forward to this review that was actually commissioned by DEFRA, but is designed to inform policy right around the UK. Like I said, that should be coming out fairly soon. So after a sort of a long delay, we are starting maybe to see a bit of a change in heart and a bit more enthusiasm for them.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've got another question from Smriti asking, is the mixed use protected area a more sustainable and stakeholder centric model for MPAs, the best way forward, even internationally?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think I would generally say yes. You know, I think there's a really, this idea of having a mixed spatial approach to managing fisheries and different activities is a really good way forward because, you know, the activities are not conflicting with each other, but they're still allowed to go on in their designated areas. And, you know, something that's happening, for example, off the coast of Yorkshire here is they have an area that is specifically just for scallop dredging. So, you know, and I like that as well. So, you know, those scallop dredgers there don't have to worry about the fact that they might be coming across crab and lobster pots. They know this area is designated just for them. It's fished under permit, and it's the access is controlled, but it works really well. But I think it's important that you know, designating the areas is just the first step. What we still need in Arran and in a lot of the marine protected areas is actual management of the activities that still go on there. So although you might think that something like creeling for crabs and lobsters has less impact on the environment, it certainly does on the seabed. But at the moment, there's no limit on the numbers of creels that can be put down. We don't have very good data on what's going on. You know, I'm not saying it's happening, but it's possible that there could be, because it's an area that is protected from the mobile gear, that it might end up with too many creels. And really, you need to be thinking, you need to be one step ahead of the game in fisheries management. And that hasn't really happened yet. So there's still, you know, there's still work to be done.
Do you have any follow-up, Smriti?
Just a quick one about, and thank you for all those details. I'm wondering about the enforcement side, and is that something that is part of what you mean by having to be one step ahead?
I mean, the one step ahead comment was more about like thinking about if you put in this management measure, what are the full implications of it? In terms of enforcement, I think, you know, again, one of the reasons why things work well on the Isle of Arran is because there is so much support for these conservation measures among the local community that there's a lot of people either on the shore, out on the water, actually looking and seeing what boats are doing. And a lot of sort of reports of any suspicious activity and of the occasional illegal activity where people have been caught, for example, once or twice fishing in the no-take zone, has come from the community. And that is really important to get that, you know, that backup, because the Scottish Government's enforcement agencies are, to be honest, a bit under-resourced, being polite. They only have a few boats. It's very difficult to be everywhere at once. You know, fisheries management is increasingly turning to electronic surveillance, but that has its own problems, because it'll tell you where a boat is, but not necessarily what it's doing. And so sometimes people end up being falsely accused. So, you know, having a range of measures is important. And I think the signs are that, you know, as time has gone on, the boundaries of these areas around Arran have been increasingly well respected. And that's why we're seeing the recovery that we are seeing now.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
We have another question from Paul Chandler, although I think the question comes from Sue Ash, asking, do you think that the current protection measures in the Clyde, a viable mixed fishery, will ever return, or will we not ever get back to the levels of fish stock?
So thanks, Paul. That's a good question. I think we definitely need to go further. I mean, you've seen, you know, some very significant changes in the fish community. We probably need a range of measures beyond what we have. I mean, the South Arran no-take, marine protected area is a big area, you know, and I'd like to think over time that it's going to contribute significantly to fish populations, because we know there's a lot of juvenile fish in there, but we also need to make sure that once fish sort of grow up and move out of those areas, that their habitats outside the protected areas are being looked after, that the fish are not being caught in bycatch. So there's things that could be done perhaps to make the fishing gear more selective. More of these mixed use zones, I think, would be the way ahead. I think what we're seeing is the start, but probably to get things back to how they were 50 or 100 years ago, it's really going to take a dramatic change. But you know, in my humble opinion, I think it is very important, because at the moment we have a fishery in the Clyde that just really focuses on mainly Dublin Bay prawn and a couple of other shellfish species, and that leaves them very vulnerable. And I previously used to worry about what happened if a disease went through the prawn stock and there were no prawns, you know, and that would take away sort of 80% of the fishery for the whole fishing community. But we've since seen that other things, like a collapse in markets because of coronavirus, has really had the same effect. So unfortunately, the fishermen in the Clyde and on the west coast of Scotland were some of the very first to have to stop fishing because of a loss of markets because of coronavirus. So if you have a more diverse resource base, more different species in the sea, then, you know, you're going to be more resilient to those sorts of shocks to the system.
Thank you. Do you have any follow on from that, Paul?
It's Sue here. No, that was great. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you. We've got another question from Magnus Johnson asking, do you see fishers targeting the edges of the reserve? Is it heavy, and does it impact on the overall aims of the project?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So definitely we don't have fantastic evidence for this, because unfortunately the data is not collected that well by Marine Scotland. However, we do know anecdotally from the local crab and lobster fishermen that they'll fish around the no-take zone, and they tell us that they get good catches there, and the evidence appears to back that up from our surveys. Funnily enough, some research is just being done using the Global Fish Watch database, which is based on AIS vessel monitoring. And I was talking to a researcher from Cambridge just yesterday, in fact, and he says there's, from his analysis, good evidence that they are fishing around the boundaries in sort of higher numbers. These are the prawn fishermen. And it's hard for me to say whether that's affected the prawn fishery because that we haven't monitored that. In terms of the scallops, the habitat around the edges of the marine protected area is not suitable for scallops, so any benefit to the scallops would be further away. So it'd be really hard to know for sure if that's going on. But there does, definitely seem to be some increased activity around the boundaries. So, I guess that's a good sign. Like it shows that there's, they wouldn't be doing it if there wasn't a reason. So hopefully there's some spillover going on.
Do you have any follow on from that, Magnus?
Yes, thanks very much. Nice to meet you, Bryce, sort of. I just wonder if one of the things that we're seeing is a growth in the coastal areas and in zone fisheries of creel fishing, potting. It's become a bit of a monoculture. So there's probably 100,000 pots between Spurn Point and Teesside. And those are, there must be an impact from this. We kind of have this dagger-like single species, single meteor approach to fisheries rather than having a broad foot stick trod lightly. And I wonder if that's a problem caused in part by some conservation measures that we're putting in place.
Gosh, I think there's a range of different reasons why that's happened. Like with my answer to Paul, I agree that that's a problem because, you've sort of lost resilience in the system. I think originally people obviously switched more to shellfish because the fin fish stocks were overfished. So that's the original problem. Now, what we're seeing, yes, like I said, is in some areas, huge expansion of the creel or pot fishing. And yeah, I'm obviously familiar with what's going on off the Holderness coast. And it's not going on, at least as far as I know, to the same extent in the Clyde, but so there are some reports of increased activity, and like I said, it's something that I'd like to see the Marine Scotland looking after, because it is a danger not just in that protected area, but in others, that you end up, with this law of unintended consequences. You protect an area of seabed from one activity, but then you, by mistake, you encourage a different one that has different effects. And so, yeah, it would be good if those creel and pot fisheries were better managed for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions, but we've run out of time. So I will forward those on to you.
Okay.
And let you know what people are asking.
Yeah.
But I would like to say thank you very much it was a fascinating talk and nice to see that something positive can happen with community buy-in. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
My pleasure.
Yeah, excellent. And there will be some more Ask the Author events from Yesi. So just keep your eye on the Yesi website, the events page, to keep up to date with those. And once again, thank you very much.